I have told this story only once before to my wife, on the night we returned from Velthamn Hall after the wedding. She sat in the carriage with her hands folded and listened without interrupting, which is not her custom, and when I had finished she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You knew. You knew the whole time and you said nothing." I told her I had suspected. I told her there is a distance between suspecting and knowing that a gentleman learns to respect. She told me I was infuriating. I told her I loved her. She told me that was beside the point. But she was smiling, and it was the particular smile she reserves for stories that end well, which this one does extraordinarily, improbably, and completely. My name is irrelevant to any of this. I am simply the man who was present. I was there in the provincial theatre the first night, and the 15th and the 31st, because wherever the Duke of Velthamn went in those years, I was generally in the next seat. We had been friends since we were boys. His father's estate bordered mine, and we had spent 20 years proving between us that opposites do not merely attract but form a bond that no amount of difference can dissolve. I am by nature sociable. I enjoy a room. I enjoy a supper table with 8 people on it and 3 conversations happening at once, and I enjoy the particular pleasure of watching those conversations collide. The Duke, whose name I will give you now since titles grow cumbersome, his given name was Crispin, though almost no one alive used it, did not enjoy rooms. He did not enjoy supper tables with 8 people. He had not enjoyed society in any form since his father's death 11 years before, and the death of his young wife 4 years after that. And the result was a man who had drawn himself back to Velthamn Hall in the Northumbrian countryside, and stayed there with a completeness that had become, in certain London drawing rooms, almost legendary. The elusive Duke, they called him. I had heard it said with a dozen different tones: admiration, irritation, romantic wistfulness, by any number of people who had never met him and would not have known what to do with him if they had. He was not elusive for the sake of mystique. He was simply a man who had lost 2 of the people he loved most in the space of 7 years, and had concluded, reasonably if not cheerfully, that the world outside his gates offered him nothing worth the effort of opening them. I will not pretend that I had fully accepted this verdict. I visited Velthamn when I could once or twice a year, sometimes more, and I spent those visits in the patient, occasionally maddening project of reminding Crispin that the world had not actually ended, whatever it might feel like from the Northumbrian coast. We rode. We argued about books. We played chess badly, both of us, and disputed the results. Once, in the 3rd year of his self-imposed retirement, I managed to persuade him to attend a small dinner at a neighbor's house 4 miles off, and I considered it such a victory that I wrote to my wife about it in terms more suited to a military campaign. So when I say that Crispin left Velthamn Hall 31 times over a period of 2 years to attend performances at the Harwich Provincial Theatre, I need you to understand the full weight of that number. 31. I accompanied him the first time on a wager. I had bet him, recklessly, that there was nothing within 50 miles of the hall worth leaving the library for, and a mutual acquaintance had mentioned a singer performing at the Harwich Theatre under the bill's heading of The Starling. And Crispin, who in those days would take any excuse to prove me wrong about anything, had put on his coat and said we were going. The theatre at Harwich was small and provincial and impeccably managed and smelled of candle wax and old velvet. The stage had a curtain of deep blue. The audience that first night numbered perhaps 60, a mix of local families, a few merchants, a scattering of visitors from the surrounding estates, and one Northumbrian duke who sat with his arms folded, and his expression arranged into what I privately called his "I am not going to enjoy myself" face. I knew that face very well. I had seen it at dinners, at christenings, at a concert in London years before the retirement, and I knew it was not hostility, but rather a kind of armor, the face he put on before anything he suspected might dismantle him. The curtain opened on a darkened stage, and a woman walked to the center of it, and she began to sing. I will not attempt to describe the voice. I am not a musical man. I can appreciate a fine performance with the sincerity of an enthusiast and the vocabulary of a carpenter. But I know that the room changed when she opened her throat, the way a room changes when someone sets down a lamp in a dark corner, and you realize the corner was never empty. It was simply unlit. She was not performing a grand operatic piece. The song was a simple one, an old melody I half recognized from some childhood nursery or other, but she had done something to it, had found in it a grief and a tenderness that were not, I would have sworn, written into the notes themselves, but lived there all the same, waiting for exactly this voice. By the second verse, the woman 3 seats to my left had her handkerchief out. By the third, I was sitting very still. And Crispin, who had come with his arms folded and his armor on, was sitting with his arms unfolded and his hands open in his lap, and his face was the face of a man who has walked into a room expecting nothing and found everything he didn't know he was looking for. I said nothing about it afterward. It is one of the first principles of a long friendship that you do not always say the thing you have noticed. We drove home in the dark, and Crispin looked out the window at the passing countryside, and I talked about the supper we had been promised at Carstairs Place the following week, and he listened in the way he listened when he was not quite inside the conversation, and that was all. 3 weeks later, he said he thought we might go back to Harwich. We went back to Harwich. I remember the second performance more vividly than the first, which is unusual. First occasions generally leave the deeper mark. But on the second night, I was watching Crispin more than I was watching the stage, and that gave the evening its particular texture. He arrived with the manner of a man who has decided he is making a practical inquiry rather than a sentimental one, as though 30 miles of winter road might be explained by curiosity rather than need. He bought a program. He read it carefully. He noted the order of the pieces with the application of a man cataloging something. And then the curtain opened, and the gauze screen glowed, and the starling began. And within 8 bars the program was on his knee unread, and every practical explanation he had brought with him had quietly dissolved. There were evenings when the program was a love song. There were evenings when she sang something ancient and modal that seemed to come from a time before any of us had been thought of. On the 19th night she sang a setting of a poem I recognized, a meditation on lost things, on the particular persistence of longing when its object is gone, and I heard, 2 seats to my left, a gentleman old enough to be my father put his hand over his mouth and look at the floor. I looked at Crispin. Crispin was looking at the stage with his jaw set and his eyes bright, and I understood then that whatever he had lost, his father, his wife, the decade he had spent walling himself inside Velthamn, was being held up to him in that voice and given back, not as grief, but as the thing that had been worthy of grief. Not loss itself, but the love that had made loss possible. We never spoke about it in those terms, but I knew, and he knew I knew, and that was its own kind of intimacy between old friends. This is how 2 became 7, and 7 became 15, and 15 became 31. He never explained it. I never asked him to. I watched over the course of those 2 years as something shifted in my oldest friend, not dramatically, not with the kind of visible transformation that makes for a good story in the retelling, but quietly, the way ice shifts in late February, giving without announcing itself. He smiled more. Not often, and not at anything I could reliably identify. It was the private smile of a man turning a thought over in his mind, not the social smile of a man performing contentment. He returned to a piece of music he had abandoned years before, a composition of his own that had sat unfinished on the piano at Velthamn, and he worked at it again in the evenings, which was something he had not done in the 7 years I had known him as a widower. He was not happy, exactly. He was something more tentative than happiness, and considerably more alive than what he had been. I did not know in those months that he had never seen her face. This requires explanation. The curtain arrangement at the Harwich Theatre was such that the starling performed behind a gauze screen, partly a theatrical affectation, partly, as I later understood, a practical necessity. She never took a curtain call with the screen drawn back. The bill always listed her as the starling, a provincial engagement, no likeness to be given. I had assumed, in the vague way of a man not paying close enough attention, that this was simple theatrical mystique, a clever manager's marketing device. I had seen her silhouette, her posture, the general impression of a slender woman in a dark gown, and nothing more. It had not troubled me. The voice was the thing. The voice was entirely the thing. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, when she told it to me herself over tea at Velthamn one winter afternoon, was that the concealment was not a marketing device. It was a necessity born of a fact she and her father had agreed upon before her first performance, that a debtor's daughter singing in a provincial theater, under her own name, in a county where her father owed money to half the gentry, would not be permitted to sing at all. The name Maren Ashby could not appear on a playbill. She had performed for 2 years as the starling, and the starling had no history and no family and no debts and no face. Only a voice, only that extraordinary, heartbreaking voice and the protection of the blue gauze screen. Maren, I will use her name from here because she is the center of this story, and she deserves to live in it fully. I think often now about those evenings at the theater, what they were for him and what they were for her, and how entirely separate they remained in their separate darknesses until the night they were not. He would come in with his coat and his silence and sit in the third row, which became, over time, his row, the seat he always chose, slightly left of center, as if he had taken the measure of the acoustics and decided that there, and only there, was the voice received in its truest form. I sat beside him, performance after performance, and watched him cease to be a man under armor and become simply a man, open, intent, wholly absorbed in a voice he had no name for. On the 7th night, I made the mistake of saying something during a pause between songs, something inconsequential about the program, and he looked at me with a sharpness that suggested I had committed a serious breach. I did not speak during performances again. After the 15th, on the drive home, he said, without preliminary, "Do you suppose she knows what she does to a room?" I considered this. "I don't think people who do it naturally ever quite know," I said. He did not reply. He looked out the window. After a mile or two, he said, "She finds grief in things that are not written to be grieving, and makes it not desolating, makes it bearable somehow, as though grief were simply the other side of something that was always worth having." I had nothing to say to that which would not have diminished it. I said nothing. We drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and I thought, in the dark of the carriage, he is talking about his wife. He is talking about his father. He is talking about 11 years of a door that would not open. And this voice, this invisible, unnamed, ungiven voice, has reached through the door without even knowing there was a door to reach through. After that, I stopped counting the performances and simply went. I did not know, and Crispin did not know, that the woman behind the screen was doing her own separate thing in those hours, was inhabiting, for those performing hours each month, a self that the rest of her life did not allow. Maren had told me, in that same winter afternoon conversation, that the stage had been the one place in those 2 years where she was not a debtor's daughter managing consequences, not a woman watching her options narrow, not a person carrying her father's failures in silence. On the stage, behind the screen, she was only the voice, only the music, only the thing she was most completely, given back to her each performance in full, with no cost attached. She had not known, she said, whether to be grateful for it or to grieve for it, that the fullest version of herself could only exist in a concealment so complete that no one in the audience even knew what she looked like. She had known, though, that someone in the third row came back. She could not have said how she knew. The screen was too dense for faces, and she did not make a practice of counting. But she had noticed the shape of an attendance, a particular stillness in that part of the house, a quality of reception that is different from the reception of a large audience, more concentrated, more complete, as if one member of the 60 were listening with the whole of himself rather than the customary fraction that people bring to an evening's entertainment. She had not known who. She had not allowed herself to think about it beyond noticing it, because a woman in her position does not build much on noticing. And then the theater closed. And then some weeks later, she arrived at Velthamn Hall. She told me she had not made the connection until the second day. She had not expected it. His name meant nothing to her in relation to the theater. Why would it? The playbills did not name the audience. She had been shown the house. She had met Lady Hartwell, and she had been introduced to the Duke, and she had thought him reserved and courteous and possessed of a quality she could not immediately name. And then on the second morning she had come into the east drawing-room to bring Lady Hartwell her correspondence, and found him at the piano, his back to her, playing a passage from the second act of the last program she had ever performed, and she had stood in the doorway with the letters in her hand and understood, all at once, who the stillness in the third row had belonged to. She had not, she told me, been frightened exactly. What she felt was something more complicated, a kind of vertigo, as though the floor had shifted slightly, as though the terms of her situation had changed in a way she needed to think about very carefully before she did anything at all. She had gone back upstairs and thought about it for the rest of the morning. She had decided to stay. I say this simply because it is the fact of it. She was a woman who could have taken herself and her secret out of that house on any one of the mornings that followed. Lady Hartwell would have found another companion. The arrangement would have been dissolved without damage. She was not trapped at Velthamn, not by the terms of her employment, and not by anything Crispin had said or done. He had given her no reason to fear him, no reason to think he would expose what he was only beginning to suspect. She stayed because she chose to stay, and I think the choosing of it was the first fully free thing she had done in 2 years, and she made it with eyes open. I met her for the first time not at the theater but at Velthamn Hall itself, 3 months after the 31st performance, which, as it happened, was also the last. The theater at Harwich closed in late autumn, a matter of the manager's finances rather than any decision on the part of the company. I remember Crispin receiving the notice of the closing with a stillness that was, in someone who had long been still by habit, almost impossible to read. He put the letter down. He walked to the window. He said after a moment, "Well," and that was all. I stayed for another 2 weeks and watched him return to his armor, and it was the quietest grief I have ever witnessed in a man who refused to call it grief at all. It was perhaps 6 weeks after that when his aunt arrived. Lady Hartwell, Lady Constance, his father's youngest sister, a woman of fierce opinions and fragile health, had been managing a decline for the better part of a year, and had concluded, with the practicality that distinguished all her decisions, that she would prefer to manage it at Velthamn than at her own house, where the drafts were impossible and the company was dull. She arrived in the first week of November with 2 trunks, her personal maid, her physician's instructions, and her companion. Her companion. I was in the library when they arrived. I heard the carriage on the drive and the noise of the household stirring, and I heard Lady Hartwell's voice carrying through the front hall in the particular tone she used when she was both exhausted and determined to appear otherwise. And then the footsteps on the stone. And then the door opened and Crispin came in to tell me Lady Hartwell had arrived, and would I come and be sociable, since it appeared to be beyond him. I came into the hall. Lady Hartwell was already seated in the wing chair by the fire, her color not good but her eyes as sharp as I had ever seen them. Beside her, standing quietly with her hands folded and her back straight, was a young woman in a gray traveling coat, her dark hair simply dressed, her face turned slightly away from us as she said something low to the footman about the trunk. Crispin introduced me. He turned to introduce her, and she turned toward us and he said her name, Miss Marin Ashby, Lady Hartwell's companion, and I watched his face as he said it. He had never heard her name before. There was no recognition in his face of her name. It was a stranger's name to him, one more young woman employed in one more household, of no particular note. And yet something happened when she turned, some shift in his attention, a focus that arrived without announcement, as if a compass needle had been asked for the first time what it thought of north and had answered without hesitation. She met his gaze with the directness of a woman who has long since decided that modesty of bearing does not require modesty of spirit. She curtsied. She said she was glad to make his acquaintance. Her voice, speaking, not singing, a perfectly ordinary voice in a perfectly ordinary sentence, was nothing like the starling's. Or rather, it was something like it, in the way a river seen from a distance is something like a river seen up close. The resonance was there, the particular quality of breath support, the subtle roundness of the vowels. But a speaking voice and a singing voice are, in most people, sufficiently different that a man would not leap from one to the other unless he was listening for it. Crispin was listening for it. I could see that from across the room, though I doubt she could. He heard something. He did not know what he heard. He was a man standing at the edge of a recognition that had not yet become conscious, as though he could feel the shape of a thought that had not yet arrived. I thought, this is going to be extraordinary. I said, how was the journey from town? The roads through Selby can be abominable this time of year. The weeks that followed were among the most quietly extraordinary I have spent under any roof. Lady Hartwell was a demanding patient, not unpleasant, not unreasonable but thorough in her requirements and accustomed to having them met, which meant that Marin's days were full and structured and left little room for extended society. She sat with Lady Hartwell at dinner. She read aloud in the evenings. She managed the household correspondence that Lady Hartwell's condition made difficult. She was, in every visible respect, a model companion, composed, capable, kind in a way that was entirely without performance. She was also, and this I noticed from the beginning, careful. Not guarded in the way of an unhappy person or a frightened one. Careful in the way of someone who has built a life that depends on certain information being kept in its proper place, and who has become so skilled at the keeping that it no longer costs her any visible effort. She was warm with Lady Hartwell. She was courteous with the staff. She was pleasant with me in the easy way of someone who has no reason to be otherwise, and with Crispin she was correct. Respectful of his position, attentive to his comfort as Lady Hartwell's host, neither familiar nor cold. The model of a companion in a house she did not own, to an employer she served and an employer's nephew who was powerful and reclusive, and about whom she had likely been told a great deal before she arrived. I wondered sometimes what she made of him. I never asked. I watched instead, and I noted the ways in which their interactions were not quite as ordinary as they both, in their different ways, appeared determined to make them. There was the evening with the music. It was perhaps 3 weeks after their arrival. Lady Hartwell had retired early, and Marin had seen her settled and then come downstairs, I think with the intention of collecting a book from the library before she too retired. I was in the library as usual, and I heard the piano begin in the next room. Crispin played seldom and always alone, late in the evenings. It was one of those facts of his private life that I had absorbed over 20 years of friendship without ever commenting on it, because to comment would have been to make it something other than what it was. A man alone with his grief and his music, working through one with the help of the other. But the piece that began was not his composition. It was a melody I recognized, one of the simpler songs from the Harwich Theatre program, not the Starling's repertoire, but a piece I had heard played as an interlude between acts. I put down my book. Across the hall the piano stopped. Then it resumed, but differently, a chord progression altered, a rhythm adjusted, as though he were searching for something inside the melody that he had not been able to fix by memory alone. And then, and this is the moment I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count, Marin came through the library door, not looking at me, her attention caught by something in the other room, her head slightly tilted in the manner of a person trying to identify a sound. She stood in the doorway. The piano played on. She did not know I was watching her. Her lips moved very slightly and no sound came out, but I recognized in that silent movement the shape of the melody she knew. The melody as it ought to go, not the altered version Crispin was playing. She caught herself. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the book she had come for, found it, and went back to her room. I sat with my book open and unread for a very long time. I did not go to Crispin with this. I will be asked, in any retrospective account of events, why I did not simply go to Crispin that evening and say, "I believe your aunt's companion may be the woman you have been driving 50 miles to here for 2 years. I did not because I was not certain. I was also not entirely certain, if I am honest. That certainty was what the situation required. There are moments in a story when the people inside it need to find the thing themselves, when to deliver the answer from the outside is to deprive them of something essential. I had watched Crispin for 2 years become incrementally, tentatively more alive. I had watched Marin in 3 weeks arrange herself very carefully in a house where the one person who might recognize her almost certainly would, if he looked closely enough, and I had also noticed that she had not left. She was a woman who had managed her own circumstances with intelligence for a long time. She knew, I think, that there was a risk here. She had chosen to stay within it. So I waited, I watched, and the story moved as it was going to move. It was the humming that did it. Lady Hartwell had a good week, a stretch of 5 or 6 days in which her condition seemed to stabilize, and her spirits lifted markedly, which lightened the entire household. On the last day of that stretch, a Saturday, the weather cleared to one of those cold, bright afternoons that the Northumbrian coast offers in December like a gift it doesn't intend to make a habit of, and Lady Hartwell declared she wanted air, and Marin arranged a short walk in the kitchen garden, which was sheltered enough to be bearable. I came along as far as the gate, stopped to speak with the head gardener about something, and fell behind. I came around the corner of the walled garden to find the 2 of them ahead of me, Lady Hartwell moving slowly with her cane, Marin at her side. Marin was humming. She did not know I was close enough to hear, did not, I think, fully know she was doing it. It was something in the minor key, something I half recognized and could not immediately place, and then she lifted the melody 2 bars higher and I placed it, the Starling's closing piece, the one that had brought the woman with the handkerchief to tears on the first night. The one that Crispin, in the carriage home from the 15th performance, had said with an uncharacteristic openness that he thought was the most beautiful thing he had heard in 10 years, and then had gone quiet as though surprised at himself for saying it. I stopped walking. Lady Hartwell said something. Marin answered. They moved on around the far wall and out of sight, and I stood in the thin December sunlight and thought about what to do with what I had just heard. I was still standing there when I heard Crispin's step on the path behind me. He had come out with a coat and the intention of joining the walk, and he found me stationary in the garden path with what must have been, judging by his expression, an unusual look on my face. He asked me what was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong. I said the afternoon was fine and we ought to walk. He looked at me with the particular long look he had been directing at me since we were 12, and I had told him nothing was wrong about my father's horse, and he had gone out to the stable and found the horse with a broken shoe. He knew I was not telling him everything. He also knew I was not going to tell him everything. So he fell in beside me and we walked, and neither of us said what was in our minds, and the garden was quiet and cold and very bright. He knew before the week was out. I did not tell him. I do not know precisely when the knowledge became complete for him, whether it came at once, in a single moment of understanding, or accrued over several days the way it had been accruing in me for weeks. He never told me which it was. What I know is that by the following Thursday, when Lord Craston wrote to Lady Hartwell to say he proposed to spend a few days at Velthamn on his way north, Crispin's response to the letter was 3 words: Craston is coming. And the way he said them was not the way a man announces a house guest. It was the way a man announces a problem. I knew Craston. Everyone in Northumbrian society knew Craston, the Earl of Craston, lord of an estate that bordered the Harwich district, a man of substantial property and insubstantial character, the kind of person who knows a great many things about a great many people and manages those things the way a collector manages objects, not for the warmth they give but for the power of having them. He had handled, as I later understood, some part of the financial arrangement that had brought Maren and her father to their present circumstances. Not caused it, not quite, but been present at it in some professional or neighborly capacity that had given him information he had, in the way of such men, carefully retained. He knew who the starling was. He knew who Miss Maren Ashby was. He knew both things, and he knew they were the same thing, and he was coming to Velthamn Hall. I went to Crispin that night, not to tell him what I knew, he knew it by then, I was certain, but to ask him what he wanted to do. We sat in the library by the fire, the hour late, and I said simply that I thought Craston's visit required some thought. Crispin looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, "She has a right to tell it herself, in her own time, in her own way, to whomever she chooses." A pause. "She has not chosen." I said, "Craston will not give her the choice." He said, "No, he will not." Another silence. "I am aware of that." I said, "What will you do?" He did not answer immediately. He turned his glass in his hands. He had not drunk from it in some time, and his face had the quality of stillness that I had learned, over 20 years, to read as the opposite of emptiness. It was the face of a man thinking very precisely about something that mattered to him more than he wished, quite yet, to acknowledge. He said, "I will not let her be humiliated under my roof." I said, "And if he tries anyway?" He said, "Then I will deal with it." I did not ask him how. I knew Crispin. I went to bed. Craston arrived on the following Wednesday evening with a valet and a self-satisfaction that seemed to have its own luggage. He was the kind of guest who immediately takes a great deal of room without appearing to, who arranges himself in a house's social life, with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this for years and knows precisely which chairs are warmest and which conversations are most worth having. He was charming at dinner. He was amusing about the London season. He was, I thought, watching Maren Ashby with the careful peripheral attention of a man who has not yet decided exactly when to play his card. Lady Hartwell had rallied well for the visit. She was fond of Crispin's house, and the presence of guests seemed to lift her rather than tire her, at least in the first days. She sat at dinner with the authority of a woman who has been the most formidable person in any room she's entered for 60 years, and has no intention of relinquishing the position now. Maren sat to her left, quieter than usual, attentive in the way she was always attentive. But I watched her hands in her lap once, when Craston was speaking about Harwich, and they were very still, which was the opposite of the way hands are when they are naturally at rest. She knew. She had known, I think, since his letter arrived. She had not run. She had set her hands in her lap and she had not run, which told me a great deal about Maren Ashby. It happened on Thursday evening. We were 7 at dinner, Lady Hartwell and Crispin as host, 3 neighbors who had come for the week, Craston, myself, and Maren at the end of the table nearest Lady Hartwell. The meal had gone well enough. There was wine and there was a decent roast, and there was the kind of conversation that fills a country dining room in December without leaving much residue: hunting, the Parliament, someone's new horses. And then, in one of those pauses that open between courses like a pocket of still air, Craston set down his glass and smiled at the table with the particular smile of a man about to enjoy himself, and he said, "I was trying to place Miss Ashby all through dinner. The name, you know, Ashby." He said it conversationally to the room as though it had just occurred to him. I knew a Reginald Ashby, Harwich district, a debtor, left a number of people in a rather difficult position. His daughter, and here he paused and looked at Marin with the expression of a man timing something, I believe performed at the local theater to cover some of his obligations. A singer. They called her the Starling. He let the word sit. She is nobody, of course, not society, but I believe this young woman may be the same. Another pause, directed now at Lady Hartwell with the air of a man performing a kindness. I thought it only fair that you should know, ma'am, given that she is in your service, you would not wish to be embarrassed. The table went very quiet. Not the quiet of a room receiving new information, the quiet of a room holding its breath. Lady Hartwell had turned to Marin. Marin was looking at no one and at everyone simultaneously, that particular composure of a woman who has had some time to prepare herself for precisely this moment and has used the time wisely. She was pale but not shaking, upright but not rigid, the stillness of someone who has decided that if she must be stripped, she will not flinch under it. She did not speak. She did not look at Crispin. Crispin had not moved. He was at the head of the table and he was utterly still, and in the 3 or 4 seconds before he spoke, I watched his face with the attention of 20 years of friendship, and I saw, beneath the stillness, somewhere behind his eyes, the thing that I had been watching build for 2 years finally arrive in full. Not anger, though there was something of that. Not the ducal authority he rarely chose to exercise, though there was something of that too. Something quieter and more absolute. Something that had made its decision long before this room had forced his hand. He said, yes. Just that at first. One word, in a voice that was neither loud nor urgent, and yet the table arranged itself around it the way a room arranges itself around a lamp. He said, Miss Ashby is the Starling. He said it simply, as a fact, without correction of Cranston's framing, without anything except an absolute refusal to allow the framing's implication to stand unopposed. And then he told the table how many times he had gone to Harwich. He did not make a speech. He did not address Cranston. He spoke to no one in particular, or perhaps to all of us equally, in the measured voice of a man saying what is true and finding that sufficient. He said that in the past 2 years he had left Velthamn Hall on 31 occasions, and that 31 was 31 more occasions than he had left it for any purpose whatsoever in the decade before that, and that every one of those 31 journeys had been made to a small provincial theater in Harwich to hear a woman sing. He said that he had never seen her face, because the theater's arrangement had not permitted it, and that he had thought for the past 2 years that the want of a name and a face was something he would simply have to live with, because the voice was enough, more than enough. And the voice was gone now, the theater closed, and he had thought that was the end of it. He paused. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Cranston had gone still. And then Crispin looked at Marin. Not at Cranston, not at Lady Hartwell, not at the table. At Marin. His eyes met hers across the length of that dinner table, and he held the look the way a man holds something he has waited a long time to put down. He said, and then she arrived here. The pause that followed that sentence was the longest in my recent memory. Cranston had gone very still. The 3 neighbors were looking at the tablecloth. Lady Hartwell had the expression of a woman who has been waiting for someone to say the obvious thing and is gratified that it has finally been said. And Marin was looking at Crispin, and for the first time since I had known her she had let whatever she had been holding behind her composure show, just for a moment, just enough, not distress and not relief but something rarer, the expression of a person who has been seen wholly and is still deciding what to do with the feeling. Crispin said, I am not embarrassed, Cranston. I am the opposite of embarrassed. She is the most extraordinary thing I have encountered in this county in 11 years, and if that is a scandal, I find I do not mind it in the least. Cranston opened his mouth. Lady Hartwell said, I think the second course has been waiting rather a long time, in a tone that indicated the second course was not what she was discussing. The dinner resumed. Not as it had been, nothing was quite as it had been, but it resumed, because Northumbrian dinners have a momentum that even the most dramatic announcement cannot entirely derail, and because both Crispin and Marin had, in their different ways, chosen to allow it to resume rather than make anything further of the evening. Craston spoke very little after that. He had come with a card and played it, and the card had not gone the way cards are supposed to go, and the particular pleasure he had anticipated had not materialized, and I watched him understand this over the next hour with a quietness that was, I thought, its own kind of answer. He left the following morning before breakfast, citing an engagement further north that he had somehow forgotten to mention on his arrival. I imagine he still cites it, in the right company, as a graceful exit. I have my own view. That night after the dinner, after the guests had retired, after the household had settled, I sat in the library with a glass I was not drinking and listened to the house. The fire had burned low by the time I heard the door, and then voices in the corridor. Low, careful, the tone of two people choosing their words with the precision of those who know that what is said now cannot be unsaid. I could not hear the words themselves. I did not try to. I heard the quality of them, which was enough. Heard the long pauses that are not uncertainty but care. Heard the occasional lift of something like wry acknowledgement. Heard the specific register of two people navigating something without a map, and finding, nonetheless, that they broadly agree on the direction. I have wondered sometimes what was said. I have imagined it, not out of prurience, but out of the natural curiosity of a man who has watched a story unfold from the outside, and always wants to know what the people inside it said to each other in the quiet. I think he told her, in some form, what he had said at the dinner table, that the 31 journeys were not a mystery he was trying to solve, but a fact about himself he had arrived at gradually and could not now unarrive at. I think she told him in some form that she had known since the second day, had recognized the shape of his attendants from behind the screen, had known when she found him at the piano that first morning, and had stayed, not from necessity, but because certain things, once recognized, are difficult to walk away from. I think they talked about her father, and about what had been quietly done about his debts, which she had known about for some time, and had not yet found the occasion to address directly. I think they talked at some point about the theater itself, about the voice and the screen and the particular strange grace of having been heard, wholly, by someone who had no idea whose voice he was hearing, and about what that meant or might mean, now that the screen was gone and the name was known, and there was nothing left to hide behind. I heard, after a long while, a silence that was different from the silence before the voices, fuller, somehow, the silence of a thing concluded rather than suspended, then one set of footsteps retreating, then quiet. What happened between Crispin and Marin in those hours I can tell you only in outline, because I was not present for the conversations themselves. What I know is that on the Friday morning, 2 days after the dinner, I came into the east drawing room to find Crispin at the piano playing the Starlings' closing piece, correctly, in full, not the altered version from before, and Marin standing by the window with her back to me, and neither of them turned when I entered, and I went back out again and pulled the door quietly behind me. What I know is that the following Sunday, when I suggested I might take my leave and return home for Christmas, Crispin asked me without any particular preamble if I would stay through the new year. I said I would. He said he had some things to work through and he found my presence useful. I told him flattery would get him everywhere. He said he was not flattering me, he was being practical. I told him I was staying regardless and he did not need to justify it. He said very well. What I know is that in those weeks, the weeks between Craston's departure and Christmas, and through Christmas itself, and into January, something in the house shifted as profoundly as anything I have ever watched shift in a life spent paying attention to the people I love. It did not shift loudly. It did not make a great announcement of itself. It was there in the way they occupied the same rooms, which became, gradually, less careful and more natural. less the arrangement of a duke and his aunt's companion, and more the arrangement of two people who are beginning to understand that the same space suits them, that they fit it better together than they do apart. It was there in the conversations I was sometimes adjacent to, conversations about music, about Marin's father, whose debts were, I learned, in the process of being quietly resolved by an unnamed party that was named easily enough if you knew to look, about the estate, about things neither of them had talked about with anyone in years. I heard Crispin say once, passing the open door of the drawing room, "I went the first time because I lost a wager, and I went back the second time because I could not explain why I needed to, and the 31 I did not intend to explain at all." And Marin's answer, which I did not catch, and then his voice again, quieter, "Yes, exactly that." It was there, most particularly, in the evening in the second week of January when I came into the library, and found not Crispin alone but both of them, Crispin at the desk with a stack of estate papers, Marin in the chair by the fire with a book, and the silence between them, the specific kind of silence that is not absence but presence. The kind of silence that two people only arrive at after they have said, between them, a sufficient number of the necessary things. She sang once more while I was there. It was not a formal occasion. It was a quiet evening, Lady Hartwell resting well, the three of us in the drawing-room after supper, and Crispin at the piano again, working through something, and Marin had been reading, and at some point, I could not tell you exactly when, because it happened the way certain things happen, without a clear beginning. She set the book down and she began to sing. Not the closed, careful voice of a woman managing her circumstances. Not the gauze-screened, unnamed voice of the starling in a provincial theater. Her own voice, full in the room, with her face in the candlelight and Crispin's hands on the keys and the winter pressing against the windows outside. I sat very still in my chair and thought, there it is. There is the thing that was in that theater and could not quite be held. Here, in this room, held at last. When she finished, there was a silence, and Crispin's hands rested motionless on the keys, and then he said her name. Just her name. The way you say a thing when you have been waiting to say it as itself, without anything attached to it, and the moment has finally arrived. They were married in March, in the small church at the edge of the Velthamn estate. Not a society occasion, not a London affair, but the kind of ceremony that suits people who have decided the important things privately, and are marking them publicly without pomp. Lady Hartwell attended and looked more healthy than she had in years, which her physician attributed to the Northumbrian air, and which I attribute to the satisfaction of a woman whose household has arranged itself exactly as she had privately intended. The three neighboring families who had been at that December dinner attended and greeted Marin with the warm, uncomplicated affection of people who had liked her on her own terms well before they knew her history. Crispin's brother came from Edinburgh, a man I like unreservedly, and shook Crispin's hand with an expression of relief so profound it almost made me laugh. I stood beside Crispin as his groomsman, which is where I had stood for his first wedding, on a warm morning 11 years before that, in a country church not unlike this one. I had stood beside him then as a young man beside a young man, with the ordinary happiness of a friend watching a friend begin something good, and the ordinary confidence of someone who believes that goodness, once begun, generally continues. I had learned since then that goodness is not always continuous. That it has interruptions, long, dark, cold interruptions, and that a man who comes through such an interruption intact, if considerably altered, is something more than simply fortunate. I stood beside him now with a happiness considerably less ordinary, the happiness of a man who has watched someone he loves walk a very long road back to himself and arrive, at last, at the place he was always walking toward. Not the same place he started from. Somewhere better and harder one and more fully understood. Crispin was 41 years old on the morning of his second wedding. He was not the man he had been at 29, and I would not have wished him to be. He was quieter and more certain, and considerably less inclined to pretend that things did not matter when they did. He had, over the past months, been visibly learning to put down the armor that 11 years of loss had made habitual. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the gradual and irreversible way of a man who has found that he can afford to be without it, because the person standing beside him is someone who will not exploit the exposure. Marin came down the aisle on her own, which was how she had requested it. Her father was present somewhere in the back pews, a quieter figure than the man whose poor decisions had set so much of this story in motion, but she had not asked to be given away. This struck me later as entirely right. She had not been given anywhere. She had arrived where she chose to arrive, as herself, on her own terms, in front of a room of people who knew the full measure of her. Crispin watched her come down the aisle the way he had watched her, I imagine, the first time she turned toward him in the front hall of Velthamn, with that attention that was not simply looking but recognizing. That compass needle certainty. That face of a man who knows, with the kind of knowing that does not require argument, that the woman walking toward him is the most important person in the room. She was, of course. She always had been, in every room she had ever been in, even the ones that had not known to look. Afterward, driving home in the carriage, as I told you at the beginning, my wife sat with her hands folded and listened to all of it, and when I finished she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You knew." I said I suspected. She said I was infuriating. I said I loved her. She said that was beside the point. But she was smiling, that smile, the one that means the story ended well, and of all the things I can tell you about the Duke of Velthamn and Marin Ashby, and the 31 journeys to a small provincial theater, and the one dinner in December that did not go the way Craston had planned, that smile is the thing I remember most clearly, because it means the story was true enough to earn it. They were at Velthamn Hall the last time I visited, in the autumn, 2 years on. The estate had the look of a house being lived in rather than survived in, flowers on the table in the front hall. The piano moved to a better position near the window. The walled garden replanted by someone with an eye for things that bloom late in the season and last. Lady Hartwell had outlasted every prediction her physician had offered, and was presiding at the tea table with the energy of a woman who has simply decided that dying would be inconvenient, and is deferring it accordingly. Marin was at the window when I came in, reading, the autumn light on her face and the sound of the estate's quiet going on outside. She looked up when I entered and smiled in the straightforward, unreserved way she had come to smile in that house at the people she trusted. Crispin was behind me, coming in from the north pasture with a letter from the estate manager, and when he came through the door he stopped to look at her for a moment, just a moment. Just that small, unremarkable pause that a man makes when he crosses a room toward the person who is his whole reason for crossing it, and then moved to stand beside her at the window, and she showed him something in the page she was reading, and he read it over her shoulder, and the light fell across both of them. And it was all very ordinary. It was the most beautiful ordinary thing I had ever seen. I sat where I was for a moment before announcing myself, because the moment did not need me in it. It was complete without me, as the best moments in other people's lives always are. I had spent a great deal of time over the past years in the adjacent rooms of this story, in the next seat in the dark theater, in the library while the piano played, in the dining room while the table held its breath, in the carriage while my wife listened with her hands folded. I had been the man beside the man, which is the particular station of a closest friend, not the one the story happens to, but the one who witnesses it from close enough to feel it fully, far enough to see its shape. I would not have exchanged it, not any of it, not the 31 cold drives to Harwich, or the long evenings watching Crispin come back to himself by degrees, or the night I sat in the library, with an undrunk glass waiting for a corridor to fall quiet. Not even the Sunday mornings at Velthamn when it had seemed, in the long middle years, as though nothing would ever shift, and the house would stay forever in its amber of grief and silence. Because without all of that, this moment, a man pausing in a doorway to look at the woman reading by the window, The ordinary perfection of it would not have been what it was. I found my chair and my tea and I settled in, and Lady Hartwell said, "You are smiling again," and I said, "I generally am, ma'am," and she said, "Yes, but that particular smile," and I said I didn't know what she meant, and she said I most certainly did. She was right, I did. I have turned the story over many times in the years since, looking for the place where it might have gone differently, the branching points, the moments where a different choice would have led to a different ending. Crispin might have stayed at Velthamn and never taken the wager. I might have spoken. The night Marin traced the melody with her silent lips in the library doorway. Craston might have kept his card and played it elsewhere, or might have played it to a less resolute table. Any of these. The story is not proof of design, but of the dogged persistence of a feeling that, once it has found its subject, does not easily relinquish it, and of two people who were each, in their different ways, too honest and too stubborn to pretend they were not, ultimately, the same thing to each other. I think of the first night sometimes. The velvet curtain, the gauze screen, a voice finding the grief inside a simple melody and making it into something that emptied the room of everything unnecessary. And Crispin in the seat beside me, his armor gone before he knew he'd lost it, his hands open in his lap. He went back 30 times. He would have gone back 100. She was worth every one.